I'm just trying to help you find her, detective. That is not cooperation. That is target baseline calibration. When an untrained observer watches an interrogation tape, they look for fidgeting, they look for sweat, they look for broken eye contact. They assume that deception carries an unavoidable biological cost, a tax that the human body must pay in adrenaline and racing heartbeats. The polygraph instrument operates on this exact flawed premise. It is not a lie detector. It has never been a lie detector. It is a biological transducer designed to record the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. It measures fear, anticipation, and stress response. It does not measure truth. If you sit across from a suspect expecting their body to betray their guilt, you have already ceded control of the interaction. You are looking for a physical flare-up when the predator in front of you is quietly engineering the room. In 1987, law enforcement in King County, Washington, placed a painter named Gary Ridgway into an interrogation room. Ridgway was a primary suspect in a cluster of brutal homicides along the Green River corridor. At the time of that interview, Ridgway was actively hunting, killing, and disposing of female targets across the Pacific Northwest. The examiners attached the instrument. Rubber pneumograph tubes were wrapped across his chest and abdomen to monitor thoracic and abdominal respiration cycles. An inflatable blood pressure cuff, a cardiosphygmograph, was wrapped around his upper arm to track mean arterial blood pressure and pulse rate changes. Electrodes were clipped to his fingers to track galvanic skin response, recording microdermal conductivity changes driven by sweat duct activity. The examiner initiated the control question test, establishing what the polygraph protocol considers a neutral physiological baseline. Then they asked him direct, high-stakes diagnostic questions. Had he killed those women? Had he seen them? Was he responsible for their disappearances? Gary Ridgway lied directly into the microphones. He denied every single point of involvement, and as the needles moved across the continuous paper strip, the biofeedback readouts remained entirely flat. His pulse did not spike. His respiration depth did not alter. His skin conductivity showed no microsweat reaction. The instrument cleared him. Investigators refocused their assets elsewhere, leaving an active predator free to operate for another 14 years. Think about how you evaluate the people in your own immediate environment. When you sit across from someone during a high-stakes negotiation, a personal dispute, or a professional audit, what are you actually measuring? When auditing a high-stakes conversation, do you rely on what the subject is showing you, or do you cross-examine the structural data? Write your protocol below. I want to know how you separate performative stress from structural deception. To understand why the Ridgway test collapsed, we must dismantle the three biological vectors the machine relies upon. The first vector is galvanic skin response. The human palm contains thousands of eccrine sweat glands controlled directly by the autonomic nervous system. When the brain registers a threat or a breach of moral boundary, a micropulse of acetylcholine triggers those ducts to open within milliseconds. It changes the electrical resistance of the skin. The machine reads this as stress. The second vector is the cardiosphygmograph. A sudden surge in sympathetic arousal causes peripheral vasoconstriction. Your blood vessels tighten, forcing mean arterial pressure upward and accelerating your heart rate. The third vector is the pneumograph tube. Under cognitive stress, the human diaphragm shifts from deep abdominal breathing to rapid, shallow thoracic expansion. The body is quietly preparing for physical conflict or flight. These three vectors form the mechanical architecture of the polygraph, but every single one of these vectors relies on an underlying psychological assumption that the act of deception forces the target's brain into a state of acute threat response. When an interrogator relies on physical markers, they assume the subject experiences fear of detection. They assume the subject's brain treats a lie as a moral emergency. This is where the system breaks down completely. Gary Ridgway did not pass that examination because the technology suffered a hardware glitch. He passed because the instrument is completely blind to a mind that does not process moral breach through the lens of anxiety. The polygraph did not fail due to a technical error, but because the subject applied two vectors of conscious manipulation directly to his own body. The first vector is tactical somatic baseline distortion. To understand how a subject manipulates an examination from the inside out, you must understand the architecture of the control question test. Before an examiner asks direct diagnostic questions about a crime, they must calibrate the machine. They require a control baseline. The examiner will ask questions designed to produce a controlled level of autonomic friction. They will ask questions such as, have you ever taken something that did not belong to you? Have you ever lied to a person in authority? The subject is expected to lie or feel discomfort, answering these control questions. The resulting spike in blood pressure, heart rate, and skin conductivity establishes the upper limit of the subject's expected anxiety. When the examiner transitions to the relevant diagnostic questions, such as, did you murder that victim? The machine measures whether the reaction exceeds that control spike. If the reaction to the relevant question is smaller than the reaction to the control question, the software reads the result as truthful. A sophisticated manipulator does not attempt to suppress their reaction to the crime. They artificially inflate their reaction to the control questions. This is executed through covert somatic countermeasures. When asked a control question, the subject quietly applies sharp physical pain to their own body. They bite the side of their tongue with precise, hidden force. They press their toes against the floor to trigger intense isometric muscle contractions. They quietly contract the internal anal sphincter muscle, a movement completely invisible to an examiner sitting across the desk. These subtle physical triggers instantly activate the sympathetic nervous system. Blood pressure rises. Microsweat ducts open. The pneumograph tube expands as the chest tightens. The polygraph instrument records this massive spike and registers it as the subject's baseline response to a minor secondary question. When the examiner moves to the murder charge, the subject simply releases the physical tension. They stop biting their tongue. They relax the muscle group. Their autonomic nervous system settles back toward homeostatic equilibrium. When the chart is printed, the subject's physical reaction to a brutal act appears lower than their reaction to a minor control question. That is not emotional composure. That is target baseline calibration. The subject has engineered an artificial delta on the recording paper, weaponizing the machine's own mathematical threshold against the examiner. If your objective is to build cognitive immunity against predatory tactics, subscribe to Dark Mind Files. We dissect the mechanics quietly. The second vector is far more dangerous because it requires no physical trickery. It is cognitive decoupling. In a non-pathological human mind, the act of deliberate deception creates acute neurological friction. The prefrontal cortex must build a false narrative, hold the true narrative in memory, and actively suppress the impulse to tell the truth. Simultaneously, the anterior cingulate cortex flags the moral breach, sending an immediate signal to the amygdala. The amygdala processes this moral breach as an existential threat. It triggers a cascade of adrenaline, forcing the heart rate up and the sweat glands open. In a normal subject, deception is a physical crisis. A predatory mind operates under an entirely different structural wiring. They do not experience cognitive friction because they decouple the lie from the threat response. To a covert manipulator or a cold-blooded offender, an interrogation is not a moral trial. It is an operational environment. It is target acquisition in reverse. They do not view a lie as a violation of a social contract. They view a lie as a tool of structural navigation. When they speak a falsehood, their anterior cingulate cortex does not trigger an emergency alarm. The amygdala remains silent. Without limbic activation, the autonomic nervous system sees no reason to alter its rhythm. The heart rate remains at 60 beats per minute. The thoracic breathing cycle stays deep and deliberate. The skin conductivity remains completely flat. They do not pass the test by fighting their internal stress. They pass the test because their brain does not recognize a moral breach as a threat to their survival. The inhibitory brake that prevents most humans from lying without physical consequence has been systematically dismantled. This structural flaw in biological monitoring is precisely why legal frameworks were forced to adapt. In 1988, the United States federal government enacted the Employee Polygraph Protection Act, stripping private employers of the right to use these devices for pre-employment screening or routine workplace audits. Federal courts consistently reject polygraph data as substantive evidence because forensic science recognized a terrifying truth: the test rewards the most cold-blooded manipulators while penalizing anxious, innocent subjects. An innocent person, terrified of being falsely accused, will experience a massive amygdala spike during diagnostic questions. Their heart will race. Their palms will sweat. The machine will label them a liar. Meanwhile, the predator, sitting in the same chair, detached from moral anxiety and trained in baseline distortion, walks out of the room completely cleared. The moment you look for visible stress signals in a trained manipulator, the trap has already been sprung. You are expecting their physiology to perform a moral audit that their brain is structurally incapable of conducting. If you wait for their hands to shake, their voice to crack, or their pulse to jump, you are offering them total operational freedom. You are attempting to catch a predator through an emotional leak, and in doing so, you are walking directly into the exact trap they engineered. To neutralize this threat, you must abandon the amateur pursuit of emotional leaks. Stop looking for micro-expressions. Stop searching for sweating palms, shifting eyes, or slight tremors in the voice. When you attempt to audit a predator using somatic cues, you're trying to measure a signal that was deliberately turned off before you even entered the room. You must shift your focus entirely from somatic indicators to structural cognitive load. A predatory mind can quiet its amygdala and manipulate its heart rate because those are internal biological responses that can be decoupled through emotional detachment or somatic countermeasures. What it cannot alter, however, is the hard physical limitation of human working memory. Fabricating a reality requires vastly more prefrontal processing power than retrieving a genuine sensory memory. A true memory is tied to an interconnected web of sensory anchors, unstructured, immediate, and rich in peripheral detail processed by the hippocampus. A fabricated narrative is a fragile skeletal construct built entirely on logical sequence, deliberate intent, and conscious monitoring. If you allow a subject to deliver their narrative in a clean, linear sequence, you are permitting them to run a pre-rehearsed script. They have already mapped the terrain. Their autonomic nervous system remains quiet because their cognitive processing load is sitting comfortably at baseline. To break this control, you must apply a structured behavioral auditing protocol. This is not an emotional confrontation. This is a systematic cognitive stress test designed to force baseline disruption. The first phase of the protocol is nonlinear narrative expansion. When a subject presents a timeline, do not press them directly on their conclusions. Force them to navigate their account backward. Ask them to start at the final outcome and detail the precise sequence of actions leading up to it, moving backward step by step. A genuine memory can be accessed nonlinearly because sensory nodes exist independently of chronological sequence in the brain. A subject who experienced an event can easily recall what happened immediately before a specific moment without replaying the entire mental film. A fabricated story, however, relies strictly on linear cause and effect chains stored in working memory. When you force a liar to reverse their chronology, their cognitive load instantly spikes. Their brain must hold the false forward narrative in memory while simultaneously constructing a plausible, detailed reverse sequence that does not contradict any previously stated facts. Under this immense processing pressure, their performative composure begins to fracture. They do not sweat because of moral guilt. Their cognitive bandwidth simply collapses under the weight of the computational demand. You will observe long operational pauses, sudden shifts in verbal velocity, structural contradictions in minor details, and immediate attempts to simplify or escape the specific temporal frame you are auditing. The second phase is structural disparity verification. Never evaluate the credibility of an assertion by the subject's level of conviction or performative calm. High-level manipulators excel at project-level sincerity. Instead, isolate the structural anchors of their claim. Stopped myths, precise physical locations, third-party touchpoints, and digital footprints, and cross-examine those hard data points against verifiable external reality. Do not confront them with a structural discrepancy the moment you spot it. A premature accusation acts as an early warning system, allowing the subject to recalibrate their narrative and manufacture a secondary lie to bridge the gap. Let them commit fully to the false structural anchor. Ask calm, open questions that encourage them to elaborate on the details surrounding that specific point. The more detail they build around an unsupportable anchor, the larger the structural disparity becomes. You are letting them construct a detailed mental blueprint that you can later dismantle with objective data. The third phase is the tactical application of information asymmetry. In any audit, hold back a key piece of objective, verified data that directly intersects with their timeline. Do not reveal what you know or how you know it. Ask broad, low-friction questions that walk along the outer perimeter of that specific data point. Watch how they navigate the space. A truthful subject states what occurred without concern for how their answer aligns with your specific level of information, because their objective is accuracy. A manipulator will carefully probe your questions, trying to calculate the precise boundaries of your knowledge before choosing how to construct their response. When you observe a subject adjusting their narrative based on what they believe you know, you are not watching honest communication. You're watching target baseline calibration in real time. This is how you defeat an individual who can pass a polygraph. You do not attempt to outfeel them. You do not wait for their conscience to betray them. You replace reliance on physiological stress indicators with a structural cognitive auditing protocol that forces baseline disruption. When you dismantle the internal architecture of the lie, their autonomic nervous system becomes irrelevant. The structural data either holds up under audit, or the narrative collapses entirely under its own logical weight. Do not look for fear in eyes trained to fake compliance. Look for structural fractures in the logic. This was Julian Vance for Dark Mind Files. Next, we will deconstruct how covert manipulators use quiet isolation tactics to dismantle victim support networks before the first demand is ever made. End of briefing.